She was nearly 30 years old. Her steering gear had jammed back during the First World War and had never been fully repaired. One of her 4 main turrets was completely immovable. One of her engine rooms was dead, and a cement caisson, a patch over a shell hole that engineers simply hadn't had time to finish, was still hidden within her hull. And yet, this was the very ship that fired the first shots for the entire Allied fleet on D-Day. 5 days later, her shells would tear apart German tanks 8 miles inland, a range from which it seemed no naval gun had the right to hit. June 5, 1944. Darkness over the English Channel. Thousands of ships are moving toward the shores of Normandy as part of Operation Neptune, the largest maritime operation in human history, involving nearly 7,000 ships and vessels of all types. In formation is the battleship HMS Warspite, flagship of Bombardment Group D. Her task is simple to state, but deadly difficult to execute: destroy the German artillery along the coast before the first soldiers even set foot on the sand of Sword Beach. But Warspite was no new vessel. She was nicknamed the Grand Old Lady, a moniker she earned with literally every scar on her hull. A Queen Elizabeth-class battleship, launched in November 1913, she entered service in March 1915, before anyone in Europe had even heard the word Blitzkrieg. She was one of the first ships to mount 8 15-inch guns with a speed rivaling lighter hunter cruisers, 33,000 tons of displacement, racing at 23 knots. In her very first year of service, she showed the character that would define her entire life. She once ran aground in the fog so severely that she had to spend 2 months in a floating dock for repairs. Shortly thereafter, she collided with her sister ship Barham. Signalmen misread an order, taking 8 knots for 18. The ships collided, crushing Barham's bow, while Warspite lost an anchor. Both ships were repaired. This would become the battleship's trademark. She regularly found herself in trouble, and regularly fought her way out of it. A year later, at the Battle of Jutland, she was hit at least 15 times. 14 sailors died, 16 were wounded, and damaged steering gear momentarily left the crew without control. She spun in circles under the fire of the entire German fleet, while the crew fought for manual control, frantically switching to backup systems. That should have been the end of her story. Instead, it was only the beginning. Between the wars, Warspite underwent a major modernization: new boilers, new armor, new fire control systems. When the Second World War began, she fought off Norway during the Norwegian campaign, then moved to the Mediterranean. Off Calabria in the summer of 1940, she made one of the longest-range accurate shots in the history of ship-to-ship artillery duels. Her shell hit the Italian battleship Giulio Cesare from a distance of over 23 kilometers, so far that even experienced officers on board could not believe their eyes when observers confirmed the hit. A year later, at Cape Matapan, she and her sisters Valiant and Barham destroyed an Italian cruiser squadron at night, a battle that essentially ended the Italian fleet's ambitions in the central Mediterranean. Then came the turn of Crete, where German aviation literally showered every Allied ship in the Aegean Sea with bombs. Warspite took her share of the damage and was sent to the United States for repairs, returning only after the war had already begun in the Pacific. From there, under the command of Admiral Somerville as part of Force A, she crossed the Pacific and Indian Oceans to counter the Japanese threat to British interests in the region. In mid-1943, the ship returned to the Mediterranean for a new job: artillery support for landings in Sicily and Italy. It was here, during the landing at Salerno, that a German-guided bomb, a new, almost fantastic weapon at the time, controlled by radio signals directly from a plane, pierced her deck and exploded deep within her hull. 9 were killed, 14 wounded. The ship lost power and had to be towed, first to Malta, escorted by the anti-aircraft cruiser Delhi and 4 destroyers, pulled by American tugs. The tow itself proved to be a real trial. At one point, all the cables snapped simultaneously, and the helpless Warspite drifted sideways through the narrow Strait of Messina, while the tug crews desperately tried to take her back in tow. Captain Packer, who brought a damaged ship into port for the second time in his career, received a special mention in dispatches for his efforts. Admiral Cunningham, having hoisted his flag on her earlier in 1943, called her the Grand Old Lady. The name stuck forever, and with every new scar, it became all the more accurate. By the spring of 1944, the ship had returned to Britain, but not fully repaired. In Rosyth, mechanics literally patched the hole with a cement caisson and removed the 6-inch guns to compensate for the weight of the patch. One engine room never worked again. One of the aft 15-inch turrets remained jammed. It was simply impossible to turn it. The old steering defect that had plagued the ship since Jutland also hadn't disappeared. But despite all these wounds and her advanced age, she remained a weapon of immense power. Her 15-inch guns were still the most formidable argument in any naval dispute. And when the time came for the Normandy landings, there was no doubt who would lead the bombardment group. The Grand Old Lady was going to war one last time, to help open the gates to Europe. She was a veteran of a bygone era, a relic of a time when battleships ruled the waves, but she was stepping into the modern age with the same stoicism and iron will that had carried her through 2 world wars. And yet, her 8 main 381mm guns, each capable of hurling a nearly 1-ton shell over a distance of up to 20 miles, were still functional. Alongside them were 10 152mm medium-caliber guns, 4 102mm anti-aircraft guns, 32 40mm Bofors, and another 16 20mm anti-aircraft autocannons. This was enough for the command to list her in Bombardment Group D for the Normandy landings. She was not a fully battle-ready ship, but she remained the most powerful gun that the Allies could bring right up to the French coast. The Grand Old Lady had been given one more job. At 5 o'clock on June 6th, it was still dark. Warspite took up a position 26,000 yards from the shore, nearly 24 kilometers, and opened fire on the German battery near Villerville and the Montconnaissy positions, providing cover for the landing of the 3rd British Division at Sword Beach. This was the first shot fired by any Allied warship on D-Day. Before a single landing wave reached the sand, her guns had already spoken. The roar had barely subsided when 3 German torpedo boats emerged from the smokescreen meant to cover the landing flank, all firing 17 torpedoes. Warspite turned every caliber she could manage toward the boats. Shocked by the density of the fire awaiting them, they fled back into the smoke, passing their own armed trawlers that were coming to their aid. One of the Grand Old Lady's shells caught a trawler and sent it to the bottom in seconds. Meanwhile, the torpedoes found another victim. The Norwegian destroyer HMS Svenner sank in that same attack, while the shells of Warspite and other ships continued to chase the boats through the smoke. On board, life moved to the strange rhythm of war. Midshipman Andy Hamnet, for whom the first broadside of Warspite had been his baptism of fire, ran messages for the senior officer while, in his spare moments, piloting one of the ship's tenders to deliver bread from the ship's bakery to smaller vessels and ferry war correspondents to Port-en-Bessin. Meanwhile, Petty Officer Charles Pearson stepped out of the turret during a short pause in firing and saw a sky full of gliders. The 6th Airborne Division was landing near the Caen Canal. Nearby, the battleship Ramillies fired its 15-inch guns, and rocket ships let off volleys one after another. Then, several gliders crashed into the water, hit by German fire. The bodies of the fallen paratroopers and the wreckage floated past the ship's hull. "It was a bit depressing," Pearson would later write, describing a moment that contrasted sharply with the thrill of the sight a second earlier. Among Warspite's crew were several Royal Marines who had served on her in the Far East before moving to commando units. At least 3 of them would perish, either during the landing itself or in the subsequent battles on the Normandy beachhead, a reminder that even on a ship standing 20 miles from the front line, war exacts its toll. The following day, Warspite continued the bombardment, over 300 shells in 48 hours, until the guns required reloading in Portsmouth. On June 9th, she returned, this time covering the Americans at Utah Beach, before shifting back to the British sector. But the most important part of this story was still to come. On June 11th, the Grand Old Lady was ordered to take a position near Gold Beach to support the 50th British Infantry Division near Christad. The Germans were preparing a counterattack. Tanks and infantry were gathering in a forested area, hiding from Allied aerial reconnaissance under dense canopies, far enough from the shore to feel safe, 8 miles inland. For any Allied ground artillery at that moment, it was out of range. The commanders of the 50th Division knew, if this force struck now, holding their positions would be difficult, and there were no reserves available for a counterstrike. But 8 miles was not out of reach for guns capable of throwing a shell 20 miles over the horizon. The problem was different. From the ship's deck, that forest could not be seen. It lay behind a ridge of hills and rows of Norman trees. Therefore, the target was not seen by Warspite's rangefinders, but by ground observation officers sitting in trenches with radios, or by an observer pilot circling over the forest at a low altitude, radioing corrections, left, further, on target. This is the true feat of this story, a battleship firing at a target it could not see itself, guided by someone else 8 miles away. The coordinates of the forest were transmitted to Warspite. Captain Kelsey gave the order, brief and dry. 50 shells. Rapid fire, 15-inch. Warspite's 8 main guns began to speak, rapidly, one after another, again and again, while the deck shuddered and the smoke from the blasts drifted over the sea. Hamnet, who had gotten used to the roar only a few days prior, again ran with messages past the gun crews working without pause, paying no attention to the air pressure from each broadside, which felt as if it could be felt by the entire body. Behind the forest where the shells were meant to fall, there were no camera operators or newsreel crews to record the impact. But the history that followed tells the result itself. The German counterattack that the 50th Division had feared and waited for never happened. The tanks and infantry that were supposed to launch their assault a few hours later were destroyed or scattered by fire that seemed to come from nowhere, from a sea they could not even see and could not fire back upon. The counterattack on the 50th Division choked off before it even began. The very advantage that made Warspite lethal that day, her long-range guns, was also what exhausted her. By June 12th, the main calibers were so worn out from firing that the ship could no longer fight effectively. The command made a risky decision to send the battleship home not via the usual long route around Scotland, but directly through the Dover Strait, the narrowest part of the English Channel, past the German coastal batteries that had been shelling this strip of sea for years and sinking everything that came within range. No British battleship had dared such a passage since the beginning of the war. Thanks to electronic jamming of German radar, Warspite passed through the strait unnoticed. The batteries never opened fire on a ship they could have easily destroyed had they seen her in time. But luck is not infinite. On June 13th, 28 miles from Harwich, the ship struck a mine. The hull, already patched with cement and steel plates, took a new hole, and the crew once again had to fight for buoyancy, while tugs led the battleship to the nearest dock. The grand old lady was damaged again, and again she survived. After repairs, she would return once more. In August 1944, Warspite appeared off Ushant and covered the coastal batteries of Le Conquet and Cape Saint-Mathieu with fire, helping the American 8th Corps in their grueling struggle for Festung Brest, the fortress Hitler had ordered held to the last. In September, together with the monitor Erebus, she conducted a preliminary bombardment of positions around Le Havre on the eve of Operation Estonia, and the city fell 2 days later. Her final mission was a task rarely mentioned: support for the Anglo-Canadian operation to clear the Scheldt estuary to open the port of Antwerp. Together with the monitors Erebus and Roberts, she struck the fortifications on the island of Walcheren on November 1st, 1944, and returned to Deal the next day, having fired her guns for the last time in her life. By the end of the war, no ship in the Royal Navy would receive as many battle honors as Warspite, 14 in total: Jutland, Atlantic, Narvik, Norway, Calabria, Malta convoys, Matapan, Crete, Sicily, Salerno, Normandy, Walcheren, Biscay, and Mediterranean. More than any other ship in the history of the British fleet. She was decommissioned and withdrawn from active service on February 1st, 1945, even before the war in Europe had ended. Her hull was so exhausted, and this battleship, which many military theorists of that era believed had no place in the age of aircraft carriers and guided bombs, had long been due for retirement. And yet, it was this outdated ship that decided the fate of a tank counterattack on the other side of Normandy, saving, perhaps, hundreds of lives of the soldiers of the 50th Division who never even found out about it. The government considered the idea of turning her into a museum ship. The most decorated battleship of the fleet deserved better than being scrapped, but there was no money for it. In 1947, while being towed to the scrapyard, Warspite broke free from her cables during a storm and ran aground at Prussia Cove in Cornwall. There she remained, broken up right on the rocks where the last storm caught her, rather than meeting the wrecking crane at the shipyard as planned. Even her final journey did not go as intended. A memorial plaque at the site is signed simply HMS Warspite, 1915 to 1945. Broken on these rocks in 1947, her final resting place. Known to all who served in her as the grand old lady, may she rest in peace with all her valiant shipmates. If you believe an outdated ship cannot change the course of a battle, remember the 8 miles inland in Normandy that Warspite hit with her shells, a place where it seemed nothing could reach. Subscribe if you want more stories of ships that should have long retired, but didn't. And in the comments, tell us, which other old ship of the Second World War do you think deserves its own video?